This film is a work of fiction. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, or actual events is purely coincidental. All characters, dialogues, and scenarios have been created using artificial intelligence and do not reflect real individuals, organizations, or historical events. This film is intended for entertainment purposes only. The views and opinions expressed do not represent those of any real entity or individual. Viewer discretion is advised.
Major Abhimanyu sleeping in his dimly lit bedroom. His face is tense, his body restless, as he dreams of the devastating accident that shattered his life. Suddenly, Abhimanyu bolts upright, drenched in sweat, gasping for breath. This wasn't the first time. Nightmares of that tragedy haunted him relentlessly. The memory of the accident that left him broken and alone refused to fade. Not a day passed without him cursing himself, unable to forgive or forget. Since that day, peaceful sleep had become a distant memory. Abhimanyu, clad in workout gear, pushes himself through his daily jogging and intense workout routine, sweat dripping off his chiseled frame as he fights his inner demons. Post-shower, he enters the drawing room, a mug of coffee in hand, and settles down for breakfast. As he casually glances at the television, the screen is filled with breaking news from Afghanistan. The headlines scream of chaos. Following the withdrawal of American troops, the Taliban was rapidly reclaiming control of the nation. Afghanistan's president, Ashraf Ghani, visibly distressed. His government's military forces were no match for the Taliban's relentless advance. Province after province was falling under their control. The capital, Kabul, was on the brink of an inevitable assault. Knowing his life was in imminent danger, President Ghani made a hasty decision. He packed his wealth, valuables, and family into a convoy of SUVs and fled the country, abandoning his people to their fate. In a small village near Belgram, Afghanistan, where Nikat and her 10-year-old son, Altaf, live a simple life. Their home is close to an American military base, which had always been their source of security. But today, the base was eerily silent. The once bustling camp was now deserted, save for a few leftover vehicles, weapons, and 2 grounded helicopters. The soldiers were gone. Nikat stares at the empty base, her heart sinking. The sudden vacuum of security sparks fear. Like countless others, Nikat and Altaf had woken up to a reality they couldn't comprehend. Power was shifting hands, and their world was changing too fast.
How could the Americans abandon us so suddenly?
Whispered a terrified Nikat, her voice trembling with disbelief. As the weight of uncertainty presses on her, she looks at Altaf, her son blissfully unaware of the danger looming over them. Tears well up in her eyes. Her fear is no longer just for herself, but for Altaf, her only reason to keep going. The empty American base in the foreground, and a horizon that promises chaos. The tension builds. Nikat and Altaf's fate hangs in the balance, and somewhere, Abhimanyu's story is about to intersect with theirs. Nikat's heart sank as she thought about the bleak future awaiting her and Altaf, much like the millions of other Afghans living under the shadow of terror. Her fears for Altaf weighed heavier than ever. Stories of the Taliban forcibly recruiting children into their ranks and throwing them into the fire of war haunted her relentlessly. Lost in these thoughts, Nikat's mind drifted back to a time 20 years ago, when she was a young girl of 12, witnessing the Taliban's first reign of terror. Women's lives had been shackled by countless restrictions. Girls were forbidden from pursuing education, stepping outside alone, or even choosing how to dress. Freedom in any form was snatched away. Disobedience was met with barbaric punishments, public beatings, imprisonment, and even executions carried out in the streets for all to see. Thinking about those tough times, Nikat's expression heavy with sorrow as she clutches Altaf's hand tightly. With a mix of fear and urgency, she walks him back home, her thoughts spiraling with worry about how to keep him safe in an increasingly uncertain world. Meanwhile, hundreds of miles away, Major Abhimanyu was in an army club, engaging in a high-energy squash match with his friend Major Sarvesh, a skilled legal officer in the armed forces. Their banter was light, their movements swift, until Abhimanyu's phone buzzed sharply, breaking the moment. He paused, picked up the call, and his demeanor instantly shifted. India had launched Operation Sarv Shakti, a critical rescue mission to evacuate Hindus, Sikhs, and Afghan allies stranded in the rapidly deteriorating conditions of Afghanistan. The mission was urgent, and the orders were clear. Major Abhimanyu and Colonel Menon were to lead their teams into the heart of the chaos. Two Indian Air Force planes, carrying a 100-strong team of soldiers and medical staff under the leadership of Colonel Menon and Major Abhimanyu, touched Tehran Airport in Iran. Tehran served as the staging ground for the operation, given Kabul's airport was still under partial American control. Deploying from Tehran ensured smooth coordination and avoided unnecessary friction. The following day, the Indian rescue team arrived at Kabul airport. A tense and chaotic atmosphere, filled with desperate people clamoring for safety, clutching their children and belongings as panic gripped the air. Abhimanyu took charge, his commanding presence cutting through the chaos. His sharp gaze assessed the situation as he barked orders to his team. Colonel Menon monitored the mission closely from Tehran, while Abhimanyu stood at the forefront, determined to protect as many lives as possible. Few 100 kilometers away from Kabul, morning broke over Nikat's village, but instead of hope, it brought the kind of fear people wouldn't even dare dream of. As the first light of day crept in, shadows of Taliban fighters appeared on the horizon, just a few kilometers away. The sight sent a chill through the village. The remaining Afghan soldiers stationed nearby abandoned their posts, fleeing in terror. Within hours, the Taliban stormed the nearby American camp and seized control. Chaos descended upon the village. The Taliban surrounded it, systematically raiding every home. The air was thick with terror, especially among the women and young girls who were petrified. Leading this ruthless group was a man whose piercing, dangerous eyes was searching for someone in particular. When Nikat saw him from a distance, her blood ran cold. She froze, her mind pulled back to the horrors of the past, a time when she was 14. and her life changed forever. Under the Taliban's first reign, their tyranny was unrestrained. They barged into homes without warning, forcing people into submission under the guise of religion. It was during this period that Nikat's 15-year-old brother was forcibly conscripted into their ranks. Fear dictated every aspect of their lives, including her father's decision to cooperate with the Taliban for the sake of protecting his family. One day, Maqsood Azhar, a Taliban commander, arrived at their house with his younger brother Ibrahim. Ibrahim was 28, towering and broad-shouldered, with a presence so menacing it sent shivers down spines. His eyes, bloodshot and intense, reflected his violent nature, a predator sizing up his prey. Nikat's mother would always hide her daughters whenever the Taliban came, locking them away in the darkest corners of the house. But that day, for reasons she couldn't understand, Nikat found herself in their presence. That was the moment Ibrahim's gaze fell on her. He turned to Maqsood and whispered something in his ear. The next words shattered Nikat's life. Maqsood proposed Nikat's marriage to Ibrahim. Her father, enraged and horrified, outright refused.
She's just a child, and Ibrahim is far too old for her.
He protested, but Maqsood's response was chilling. Rising to his feet, he threatened Nikat's father, his voice cold and unyielding.
This marriage is lawful by our faith. Ibrahim is a warrior of our religion. Marrying him would bring honor to your family. The wedding will take place the day after tomorrow. Prepare yourselves.
As they left, Ibrahim turned back, a wicked smile plastered on his face, as if savoring his triumph. Nikat's family was shattered. Her father cursed the day he had aligned himself with the Taliban. Her mother, overwhelmed with despair, even considered poisoning Nikat to spare her the horrors ahead. But she knew the consequences. If the Taliban discovered their defiance, they would brutally slaughter the entire family. On the third day, the nightmare became a reality. The wedding took place. Tears streamed down Nikat's face as Ibrahim led her into his tent. The sight of her being taken away broke her family. Even her brother, now part of the Taliban, wept silently, powerless to change anything. Nikat returned the next day, her spirit crushed and her body bruised. But Ibrahim was unfazed, even cheerful, as he bid farewell to her parents.
I'm leaving her with you for now. I'll visit her often, and sometimes my men will come to take her to me.
His words were like poison, his smile like a dagger, and just like that, he left. Days later, news came that the American forces had launched an attack on the Taliban. Within weeks, Afghanistan was under American control. Like many others, Nikat's family finally exhaled a sigh of relief, believing their nightmare was over. Nikat clung to the hope that Ibrahim would never return. Nikat sits trembling, her mind spinning with these memories. Her eyes dart toward the man leading the Taliban fighters now invading her village. The realization hit her like a thunderclap. It was him, Ibrahim. Has he returned after 18 years? And what would she do now? While conducting searches in the village, the Taliban were identifying individuals either affiliated with the Afghan army or considered allies of the United States. Anyone remotely suspected was taken into custody. Nikat was acutely aware that, under the guise of searches and identity checks, they could come to her home at any moment. If anyone recognized her, she and Altaf would once again fall into Ibrahim's hands. If that happened, the torment would resume for her, and Altaf might face the same fate as her elder brother. Nikat had already lost her entire family to this religiously fueled conflict. She couldn't afford to lose Altaf too. She decided to leave the village immediately. Despite the Taliban's control, Nikat knew the village far better than they did. Perhaps she had anticipated this scenario, as she had prepared for it, and even briefed Altaf on what to do in such an event. The Taliban was sealing off routes leading out of the village, but the process wasn't complete yet. As dusk deepened, Nikat and Altaf sneaked out of the village, avoiding detection. After walking several kilometers, both were exhausted. Altaf could barely move, and Nikat herself was faltering. She hoisted Altaf onto her shoulders and carried him further. After some distance, Nikat spotted a truck loaded with people. She ran towards it, shouting, her voice trembling with desperation. An elderly woman on the truck heard her cries and ordered the driver to stop. Gasping for breath, Nikat reached the truck with Altaf. The people on board were heading to Kabul. Nikat pleaded with them to let her join, and they allowed her to climb aboard. The truck was filled with women and children, all fleeing the Taliban, just like her. Sitting in the truck, Nikat's mind drifted back to the days of her past. She was 15 when the US Army set up a base camp near her village. The villagers, including Nikat and her family, had welcomed them warmly. Nikat lived in a village near Kabul at the time. A year later, her brother, who had been forcibly recruited by the Taliban, returned home. It seemed as though happiness had returned to their family. They thought the Taliban's menace was over for good. But they were wrong. 5 years later, the Taliban regained strength in the rural areas, launching attacks on US camps and their allies. One ill-fated day, Taliban fighters stormed Nikat's home and captured her brother, Mehtab. He had fled from the Taliban and sought refuge with his family. For this, the Taliban branded him a traitor. Outside their home, a Taliban fighter pressed a gun to Mehtab's temple and pulled the trigger. Mehtab's lifeless body hit the ground as silence engulfed the village. After a moment of stunned stillness, Nikat's mother rushed to her son's body, crying hysterically. The horrifying scene replayed in Nikat's mind as she sat in the truck, tears streaming down her face. Suddenly, the truck screeched to a halt. Ahead, a group of Taliban fighters had blocked the road. Fear gripped everyone. The driver tried to explain that the passengers were from a nearby village, returning home after visiting a shrine. But the Taliban didn't listen. They ordered everyone off the truck to verify their identities. Suspecting 3 young men among the passengers, the Taliban mercilessly beat them with the butts of their rifles, forcing them to kneel. In front of everyone, they shot the men dead. Then, turning to Nikat, they asked why she was traveling without a male guardian, a crime in their eyes. Nikat tried to make an excuse, but one of the Taliban fighters slapped her hard and forced her to kneel. A gun was pointed at Nikat's head. She closed her eyes, awaiting her fate. A gunshot rang out. But it wasn't hers. When she opened her eyes, the Taliban fighter lay dead. For a moment, no one moved. Then they turned to see the truck driver's helper holding a revolver. He had shot the Taliban fighter. The remaining fighters turned and fired at the brave man. He retaliated, managing to kill another Taliban fighter before succumbing to their bullets himself. Panic ensued as people dove for cover, some even crawling under the truck. At that moment, an elderly Sikh man aboard the truck drew his kirpan and charged at the last Taliban fighter, slashing him across the abdomen. The fighter fell lifelessly to the ground. A collective sigh of relief spread among the passengers. They quickly climbed back into the truck and drove away. Nikat sat frozen, clutching Altaf tightly to her chest. Fear and shock rendered her motionless as the truck sped toward Kabul. Meanwhile, Major Abhimanyu, unaware of Nikat's turmoil, was tirelessly assisting his team in rescuing people. Many were being airlifted via Iran to reach India. The American forces were also executing similar operations for their citizens. None of this was simple. Afghanistan had been engulfed in the flames of war for decades, making it incredibly challenging to verify identities. No country could afford risks during such precarious times. Along with genuine evacuees, anti-social elements, dangerous criminals, and terrorists could potentially infiltrate India or America. Hence, ensuring proper identification was of utmost importance. Nikat, now just a short distance away from Kabul, was passing through the village where she had spent her childhood. A place now reduced to ruins. Again lost in memories of her past, her heart ached. 3 years had passed since her brother Mehtab was killed. Her family had yet to recover from the agony and fear. Her parents had attempted to rebuild her life, but Nikat's marriage to a Taliban member cast a shadow over her prospects. Everyone was too scared to take a stand. One night, Ibrahim suddenly returned. His arrival froze the family in terror. He stormed toward Nikat's father and struck him hard across the face for sheltering Mehtab when he had fled the Taliban. Then Ibrahim's predatory gaze shifted to Nikat. He grabbed her hand and attempted to drag her away. When she resisted, his fury exploded and he beat her mercilessly. Seeing their sister suffer, Nikat's brothers could no longer hold back. They attacked Ibrahim but were quickly gunned down by his Taliban associates. Deafening shots rang through the house and their mother collapsed, wailing in grief. Nikat, stunned into silence, was dragged away by Ibrahim as her father stood like a lifeless figure, unable to intervene. For the next 2 years, Ibrahim took Nikat from one camp to another, subjecting her to unimaginable mental and physical torture. But Nikat knew the truth. Beneath Ibrahim's masculine facade hid a coward incapable of fatherhood. Furious at his impotence, Ibrahim unleashed his frustrations by beating her even more. In one of those camps, Nikat met another woman, Salma, who had also been forcibly married to a Taliban leader. It was there Nikat first laid eyes on 6-month-old Altaf, Salma's son. Yes, he was Salma's son. Salma, too, longed for freedom, and together the women hatched a plan to escape. One fateful night, when the camp was quiet, they took Altaf and began their escape, Salma clutching a machine gun. But Altaf stirred awake and began to cry. Salma tried to stifle his cries, but the sound alerted the Taliban guards. Chaos erupted as the guards chased them, firing bullets. A shot struck Salma in the shoulder, but she urged Nikat to take Altaf and run. Reluctant but desperate, Nikat clutched Altaf and fled as Salma fought off the attackers. Salma's bravery cost her life. Bullets riddled her chest and stomach as she collapsed. Seeing her fall, Ibrahim and his men pursued Nikat, but she managed to reach the main road. There, an American military vehicle approached. Desperate, Nikat begged for help. Hidden nearby, Ibrahim and his men watched as the soldiers took Nikat and Altaf into their vehicle and sped away. The soldiers brought Nikat and Altaf to a village near Bagram. There, Nikat found temporary solace and decided to stay, knowing that returning home would endanger her father and her sister, who had married into a neighboring village. But danger continued to loom. Nikat sought the soldiers' help to rescue her family, prompting them to investigate. When they returned, they brought devastating news. Her sister and brother-in-law had died in a bomb blast a year ago. Her mother had succumbed to illness caused by grief, and her father was shot dead by Ibrahim the day after her escape. The news shattered Nikat. She collapsed to the ground, tears streaming down her face as her will to live crumbled. But then her gaze fell upon little Altaf. Cradling him close to her chest, she found a new purpose to live. Altaf was now her reason to survive. With that determination, Nikat finally reached Kabul, a city teetering on the brink of chaos where her destiny awaited. Meanwhile, Ibrahim, who was already suspicious, confirmed that Nikat was hiding in the village. He stormed into her house by breaking the door, but found no one there. Convinced that Nikat had escaped to Kabul, Ibrahim burned with rage and set out to find her immediately. The Taliban was now closing in on Kabul. Chaos reigned across the city. Like many others, Nikat reached Kabul airport amidst a frantic crowd. Everywhere, people were pleading with soldiers to help them escape to countries like India, the US, or any place safe from the Taliban. Some held their infants as evidence of their desperation. Others cried about their poverty and helplessness. Nikat joined the sea of desperate souls. The soldiers' evacuation operations were nearly complete, and they were preparing to leave Afghanistan. However, on humanitarian grounds, they were helping a few more people while staying vigilant to prevent anyone suspicious from sneaking in. Crowds gathered under the airport walls, begging the soldiers perched atop to let them in. The soldiers intermittently spoke to the people from the other side of the wall, allowing entry only after verifying identities. Only American, Indian, and British troops remained at the airport. Nikat first approached the American soldiers, struggling to communicate in broken English amidst the chaos. She pleaded for help, explaining her dire situation. When the soldier asked for her identity, she hesitated, but admitted she was the wife of a Taliban member. Hearing this, the soldier became furious. Despite her attempts to explain that the marriage was forced and she had fled to save her and her son's lives, the soldier dismissed her, pointing his gun and ordering her to leave. Undeterred, Nikat turned to the British soldiers, only to face similar hostility. Abhimanyu, perched on the wall with his Indian unit, watched the unfolding scene. For some reason, his eyes were drawn to Nikat's desperation. She sat all night with Altaf in her lap, crying silently while Abhimanyu observed her from a distance. After some time, he quietly climbed down and walked away. The next morning, Captain Sheetal, a junior officer accompanying Abhimanyu, noticed Nikat among the crowd once more. As the soldiers returned to the wall, people resumed their pleas for help. This time, Abhimanyu couldn't ignore her anguish any longer. He gestured for Nikat to come closer. Clutching Altaf tightly, she ran to the wall and cried out in broken English.
Sir, please help me. My child and I are in danger.
Abhimanyu calmed her down and asked her to explain. She recounted her tragic story, revealing her ties to a Taliban member. Understanding why no one was helping her, Abhimanyu sighed and said politely,
I'm sorry, but according to our country's policy, I can't help you.
Nikat, however, fell to her knees, begging and sobbing. Moved by her plight, Abhimanyu decided to bring her inside to speak with his senior officer. Colonel Menon arrived to hear Nikat's case, accompanied by Abhimanyu and Sheetal. Nikat tearfully narrated her story again, pleading for help. But the colonel, a strict officer committed to his duty, firmly stated,
I'm sorry, ma'am, but it's against our policy to take anyone connected to the Taliban back to India.
Realizing her chances were slim, Nikat made one final desperate plea.
At least take my child with you, sir.
Nikat knew that even an orphanage in India would be better than a life in Afghanistan for Altaf. But Colonel Menon apologized again, explaining that children over 5 years old couldn't be taken without verified identification. He issued a firm order to Abhimanyu and Sheetal to escort her out immediately. Abhimanyu hesitated, but the colonel reiterated that it is an order. Sheetal too was visibly emotional, witnessing Nikat's desperation as a fellow woman. Despite this, Abhimanyu followed orders and asked Nikat to leave. As she clung to hope, Abhimanyu explained gently,
Madam, even if I want to, I can't help you. We are bound by our country's policy. First, your husband is a Taliban member. Second, there's no one to verify your identity. I'm truly sorry, but you have to go.
Nikat's last sliver of hope crumbled. With tears glistening in her innocent, beautiful eyes, she asked softly,
Sir, does someone without family or connections not deserve help?
Holding Altaf's hand tightly, she walked away. Her words struck Abhimanyu like a lightning bolt. As an orphan himself, her despair stirred something deep within him, shaking his core and perhaps forging an unspoken bond between them. Abhimanyu stood still, watching Nikat and Altaf disappear through the gate. A wave of helplessness engulfed him, mingling with the pain of letting them go. Sheetal too felt a surge of emotion, sharing his silent grief. Without a word, Abhimanyu turned away and walked off. Sheetal, determined, approached Colonel Menon once more, pleading her case. But the colonel, firm yet visibly conflicted, explained that such situations tugged at his emotions as well. Still, he reiterated that terrorists and criminal elements exploit precisely these human sensitivities to infiltrate nations like India and expand their networks. There would be no deviation from protocol, he declared, leaving the room with a heavy heart. Elsewhere, Abhimanyu sat back on the wall, lost in thought. Not far away, Nikat sat defeated, her gaze eventually meeting his. Both locked eyes, their silence heavier than words. Abhimanyu's expression conveyed the weight of his helplessness, while Nikat seemed to silently accept her fate, absolving him of any blame. An unspoken connection passed between them, powerful, raw, and indescribable. Suddenly, a deafening roar shattered the stillness, a massive bomb blast. The explosion rocked the entire airport, sending shockwaves through the structure. Abhimanyu was thrown to the ground on the other side of the wall, and those inside the airport were hurled to the floor. Soldiers scrambled to regain control of the situation. Abhimanyu joined his team, taking charge amidst the chaos. American troops called for assistance, and Abhimanyu, along with Shital and his squad, rushed outside. They began aiding the wounded as Kabul Hospital's medical team arrived on the scene. The air reeked of destruction, with bodies strewn everywhere. The soldiers worked tirelessly, evacuating the injured to a nearby hospital. Even as he helped others, Abhimanyu's eyes desperately searched for Nikat and Altaf. Amidst the rubble, his gaze landed on Altaf, terrified but unscathed, trapped beneath the lifeless body of a woman. Rushing to him, Abhimanyu pulled Altaf out. The woman's remains were beyond recognition, but her tattered clothing resembled Nikat's. The horrifying realization hit Abhimanyu. Nikat was gone. Altaf, frozen in shock, stared blankly ahead. Abhimanyu carried him inside and seated him with the evacuees bound for India, instructing him to stay put until he returned. He then dashed back into the fray, leaving Altaf still dazed. Meanwhile, the Taliban had seized control of Kabul. Hearing about the blast, a group of militants arrived at the scene, led by Ibrahim. As they surveyed the devastation, Ibrahim's predatory gaze fell upon an injured woman, Nikat. Yes, she was alive but semi-conscious, unable to speak or move due to the shock of the blast. When the explosion occurred, another woman had been thrown onto Altaf, while Nikat had landed farther away. Though Altaf had been looking in her direction, he was too traumatized to comprehend what he saw. As Ibrahim approached her, his sinister smile deepened, while fear flickered on Nikat's face. Yet, with media and soldiers nearby, Ibrahim concealed his true intentions, maintaining the Taliban's facade of diplomacy. Medical staff arrived just then and began lifting Nikat onto a stretcher. At the same moment, Abhimanyu emerged, scanning the area. Nikat saw him but couldn't call out. The medics placed her into an ambulance and drove off. Abhimanyu spotted the vehicle, but by then it was too late. Nikat was gone again. By evening, all foreign forces had decided to withdraw from Afghanistan. The Indian soldiers, too, began verifying the identities of evacuees to ensure no unauthorized persons had slipped in during the chaos. Abhimanyu realized that Altaf, lacking proper identification, risked being handed over to Afghan authorities. Determined to fulfill Nikat's dying wish of getting Altaf to safety in India, Abhimanyu grabbed his hand and tried to lead him away. But Altaf resisted, murmuring,
"I want to go to Ami."
Abhimanyu knelt to explain, his voice firm yet gentle.
You can't go to Ami now. She wanted you to go with me to India. That's what she would have wanted.
Altaf replied.
Ami is not dead.
Stunned, Abhimanyu stared at him. At first, he dismissed it as a child's confusion. But as Altaf recounted the sequence of events after the blast, realization dawned on him. He remembered the old tattoo on Nikat's hand, something he hadn't noticed in his earlier haste. The woman he thought was Nikat didn't have it. A surge of hope coursed through Abhimanyu. Nikat was alive. Somewhere, amidst the chaos, she had survived. Gathering Altaf in a tight embrace, Abhimanyu's resolve solidified. His mission was far from over. Altaf was told by Abhimanyu that he was going to bring his mother, but until then, he needed to stay hidden. Altaf's mother had trained him to stay out of sight. Abhimanyu carefully took him to a place where the soldiers had already searched, ensuring he wasn't noticed by anyone. Sheetal had seen Abhimanyu leading Altaf away. The airport was nearly empty now. The last American flight was lined up on the runway, ready to depart, with all the soldiers heading to the US already aboard. The Afghan air traffic controller had given the Indian plane permission to take off with the first light of dawn. At that moment, Colonel Menon arrived, but Sheetal distracted him, engaging in conversation while leading him away. The colonel told her to check on the flight preparations and left. Sheetal went inside the plane and began inspecting the setup. A little while later, Abhimanyu also entered the plane under the pretext of reviewing the preparations. Sheetal asked,
"Any help, sir?"
Abhimanyu waved her off and told her to stay and continue checking the preparations. He said he was going to inspect the rear section of the plane. He then slipped behind the plane and crawled to the lower compartment, out of sight. There, he started unscrewing a cabinet to gain access to the plane from below, as the cabinet was positioned just above the right side tire. Just then, Sheetal arrived. Seeing her, Abhimanyu quickly stood up. Sheetal understood what he was trying to do. Abhimanyu lowered his head, but Sheetal said,
"Sir, no need to lower your head. You're not doing anything wrong. I'm with you."
Abhimanyu looked up, surprised, and said,
No, Sheetal, please don't get involved. If you do, you could lose your job too. Just don't tell anyone.
But after her reassurance, he reluctantly shared his plan with her. The plan was to bring Nikat from the hospital to the airport and use the cabinet's access to bring both her and Altaf into the plane. Sheetal was concerned that Abhimanyu's leaving the airport was risky, but she trusted her senior officer's judgment and bravery. So, she decided to support the plan. Sheetal returned to the airport, and with a reason, she asked an Afghan man, who was about Abhimanyu's height, for Afghan clothes. The man was happy to help. Since most people were asleep, no one noticed. She took the clothes back to the Indian plane, avoiding attention, and went inside. Abhimanyu had already changed into the Afghan clothes and kept a revolver with him for protection. He didn't carry more weapons because he wasn't sure about Nikat's condition and might have to carry her out. Night had fallen, and the airbase was shrouded in darkness. The American plane was ready for takeoff, with alternate lighting arranged on the runway. According to the plan, as soon as the American plane started moving, Abhimanyu would exit the plane via the cabinet, run, and scale the airport's wall to escape, as the air controller would be focused on the American plane. The airport wall was directly opposite to the runway. Sheetal returned to the upper part of the plane, engaging 2 or 3 Air Force personnel in conversation to distract them. She led them to the center of the plane, where they couldn't see much outside. At that moment, the American plane began rolling towards the runway. Abhimanyu had only 5 minutes left. He quickly climbed out of the cabinet and ran towards the wall. Everyone's attention was on the American plane. Abhimanyu scaled the wall and jumped over just as the American plane took off. Making his way cautiously, Abhimanyu reached the road leading to the hospital. Taliban vehicles were patrolling nearby, with men holding machine guns. Abhimanyu moved forward, hiding as he went, but one of the Taliban men spotted him from behind. He stopped Abhimanyu and demanded to know his identity. Abhimanyu knew enough Afghan to answer him, but the man became suspicious. Before the man could react, Abhimanyu quickly grabbed him, choking him and dragging him into the bushes. After a brief struggle, Abhimanyu emerged and crossed to the other side of the road. The Taliban man lay dead in the bushes with a broken neck. Abhimanyu reached the hospital, but the front entrance was blocked by Taliban guards. Ibrahim was also stationed there. Abhimanyu went around to the back of the hospital, where Ibrahim thought he had seen someone. He ordered his men to check, but they found nothing. Ibrahim, however, was suspicious. Abhimanyu reached the back of the hospital, where it was deserted. Moving through the alley, he climbed up the building and entered the hospital. Once inside, he confidently walked through the halls, holding his revolver. The hospital staff mistook him for a Taliban soldier, as no one dared question the Taliban in Afghanistan. Abhimanyu approached a nurse and asked in his broken Afghan language where the ward for women injured in bomb blasts was. The frightened nurse didn't ask questions and pointed him in the direction. Abhimanyu reached the ward. The women were sleeping. He quickly spotted Nikat, who was also asleep. Abhimanyu covered her mouth to wake her without causing alarm. Nikat startled awake, but didn't say anything when she saw him. Abhimanyu signaled if she could walk, and she nodded. He helped her stand and motioned for her to follow him. Quietly, they made their way to the window where Abhimanyu had entered and climbed down. For Abhimanyu, this was easy, but for Nikat, it wasn't. Still, with his help, she managed to climb down. As they reached the end of the alley, they saw Ibrahim standing there like a predator. Nikat froze in fear and whispered to Abhimanyu, telling him who was standing in front of them. Ibrahim's face wore a devilish grin. He set his machine gun aside, confident in his strength, knowing that Abhimanyu wouldn't dare shoot. If he did, the sound of the gunshot would alert the other Taliban. Ibrahim gestured with his fingers, taunting Abhimanyu. Abhimanyu lunged at him, but with one punch, Ibrahim knocked him to the ground. Abhimanyu struggled, but Ibrahim kicked him in the chest, and this time, Abhimanyu couldn't get up. Ibrahim advanced toward Nikat, who trembled in fear. But just then, Abhimanyu, with great resolve, stood up again. Ibrahim turned, advancing toward him, but this time, Major Abhimanyu was ready. He leaped and landed a punch to Ibrahim's nose. Ibrahim staggered back, and Abhimanyu followed with a powerful blow to his chest. Ibrahim, thinking of Abhimanyu as just another ordinary Afghan, never realized who he was dealing with. Desperate, Ibrahim pulled out a knife and lunged at Abhimanyu. But Abhimanyu dodged, using a martial arts move to throw him to the ground. Ibrahim tried to grab his gun, but Abhimanyu seized it, and before Ibrahim could scream, slit his throat with Ibrahim's own knife. Ibrahim died, gasping for air as he bled out. Nikat, in tears, felt a sense of relief. The man who had destroyed her family was finally dead. Abhimanyu, carrying Nikat, made his way back to the airport. He couldn't take her inside yet because the plane was going to be checked before departure, but he had already made arrangements with Sheetal. Abhimanyu helped Nikat climb up the wall and sneak her inside, telling her to stay hidden. Sheetal saw them and kept an eye on them as they entered. She once again began distracting everyone around her, ensuring their attention was diverted. Abhimanyu managed to slip away and head back to the airport. He met Sheetal at the airport and they summoned everyone for a meeting. Colonel Menon arrived as well. Sheetal began discussing the flight arrangements and what needed to be done tomorrow. As everyone was distracted, Abhimanyu excused himself, heading to the door of the airport. Nikat, hiding behind the wall, was waiting. Abhimanyu signaled for her to come. Nikat, skilled at staying hidden, quickly made her way to him. He led her inside and safely escorted her to the place where Altaf was hiding. Nikat, upon seeing Altaf, rushed to him and eloped him tightly. Abhimanyu asked them to stay, made his way back to meeting. The night was still young. Meanwhile, the Taliban had found Ibrahim's body and learned that Nikat was missing from the hospital. During the investigation, a nurse told them that an unknown person had come to the hospital. For this mistake, one of the Taliban slapped the poor nurse. The Taliban reached the airport, but Indian soldiers stopped them from entering. Colonel Menon came forward. The Taliban leader said they were there for an investigation. Colonel Menon replied that according to the agreement with America, they couldn't enter until the forces from other countries left. They could conduct their investigation after all the foreign forces had left in the morning. However, the Taliban leader insisted that there might be Ibrahim's killer among the passengers, who could be leaving on an Indian flight. Just then, Abhimanyu's voice was heard.
No one has entered here. I and my soldiers are alert. And besides, no one can board an Indian flight without proper identification, as all identification documents will be checked again tomorrow morning.
Colonel Menon agreed, but the Taliban leader was persistent, and the argument escalated. When the Taliban, they attempted to force their way in, the Indian soldiers aimed their guns at them. In a fit of rage, the Taliban leader shouted,
"Bring the whole army and wipe them out."
Colonel Menon immediately spoke into the wireless.
Indian Air Force and backup team attack Kabul.
The Taliban group became scared. They knew they have no other way except to leave, and with hesitation they walked away. Colonel Menon smiled and sent a message through wireless to hold fire. Morning came, and the Taliban once again arrived at the airport, but this time they didn't have the courage to enter. They were waiting for the Indian soldiers and the passengers to leave. The Indian soldiers were checking the passengers' documents. As people began to head towards the planes, Abhimanyu managed to reach Nikat and Altaf, guiding them towards a secluded corner. He had already briefed Nikat on what to do. Abhimanyu, along with his team, boarded the plane. Later, he and Sheetal quietly moved to the lower part of the plane. Nikat, now standing near the airport gate, saw the Taliban entering. She anxiously waited for the plane to start approach. The plane began to move slowly, and Nikat, with Altaf slung over her shoulder, started running towards the plane. She was running behind the plane, so no one noticed her. But then, a crowd of Afghans leapt over the walls and began running towards the plane in panic. By the time Nikat reached under the plane, Abhimanyu had opened the cabinet and hung down from below. The crowd, in a desperate frenzy, was running around the plane, hoping to be taken along.
Nikat first lifted Altaf up, and Abhimanyu grabbed his hand, pulling him up. Sheetal helped bring him inside. But some people in the crowd noticed Nikat and Altaf, and they began trying to climb into the plane from below. One man grabbed Nikat and pulled her down. Seeing this, Abhimanyu jumped down from the plane, picked Nikat up, grabbed her hand, and ran back towards the plane. But now several people were chasing behind the plane. Abhimanyu reached ahead, pulling 2 men to the ground, taking down 5 to 7 others as well. 2 people hung from the tire, and 1 man even managed to reach the top. Abhimanyu quickly pulled them off one by one. Nikat was running behind him. Abhimanyu climbed up and hung down again, trying to hold Nikat's hands. The plane was now speeding down the runway. Nikat desperately tried to grab Abhimanyu's hand. As the jet engines roared and the plane accelerated, at the exact moment, Abhimanyu dropped lower and grabbed Nikat's hand. If he had been even a fraction of a second late, Nikat would have been left behind forever. The plane took off at full speed, and Nikat's legs scraped along the ground, causing her to scream in pain. With all his strength, Abhimanyu pulled her up, and Nikat grabbed onto the upper part of the tire. Abhimanyu tried to lift her so Sheetal could grab her hand, but Nikat's hand slipped, and she started falling. But in a flash, Abhimanyu grabbed her hand just as the plane took off. Abhimanyu was holding on to the upper part of the tire, and Nikat was hanging only from his hand's grip. Using all his strength, he pulled her forward, and then hoisted her up. This time Sheetal grabbed her hand and pulled her up inside. Just then, the plane's tire began to fold inwards, threatening to block the cabin. But with lightning speed, Abhimanyu leaned to the left, grabbed Sheetal's hand, and pulled himself back inside. The tire folded back, and everyone breathed a sigh of relief. Nikat, holding Altaf to her chest, began crying. Meanwhile, Colonel Menon was looking for Sheetal and Abhimanyu. As feared, he became suspicious and, with 2 soldiers, came downstairs. Seeing Nikat and Altaf, he quickly understood the situation. He grabbed Abhimanyu by the collar and yelled,
"How dare you do this? You were the one who killed that Taliban leader outside, right?"
Abhimanyu remained silent. Colonel Menon said,
"And you, Sheetal? You were involved too."
Before Sheetal could say anything, Abhimanyu spoke up.
No, sir. Sheetal just arrived here. She doesn't know anything.
Colonel Menon ordered the soldiers.
"Arrest him."
The soldiers hesitated, unsure how to arrest their senior officer, but Abhimanyu nodded at them to follow the order. They cuffed him. Colonel Menon told Nikat, Altaf and Abhimanyu to stay there and informed Abhimanyu.
"You will be court-martialed."
He left with the soldiers. Soon after, Sheetal went upstairs to speak with Colonel Menon. Nikat apologized to Abhimanyu, blaming herself for the situation, wishing he hadn't helped her. But Abhimanyu replied that everything he did for himself. He was an orphan and knew what it felt like when people leave you to fend for yourself. Abhimanyu was feeling emotionally attached to Nikat, so he opened up to Nikat about how, due to one mistake, he had witnessed the death of his wife and young child. Abhimanyu had an inkling of how dangerous the place was. But his wife, Akansha, insisted on visiting Baramulla. That's when terrorists attacked. Abhimanyu and his 5 soldiers fought bravely and managed to escape in a jeep. But while fleeing, the terrorists shot at them. The bullet missed Abhimanyu but struck Akansha and their child, killing them instantly. Abhimanyu's eyes welled up with tears. Nikat placed her hand on his. Sheetal went to speak with Colonel Menon, trying to reason with him. But he refused to show any leniency, saying that Abhimanyu's actions were unforgivable. Sheetal, however, asked,
"So why did we join the army? Are protocols more important than the life of an innocent person? And if any of us were in such a situation, what would we pray for? And yes, sir, I'm also part of this plan."
She saluted Colonel Menon and left. The colonel had no response. By then, the plane had landed in Delhi. Colonel Menon approached Abhimanyu and, unlocking his handcuffs, said,
"I understand your emotions, but you know we are all bound by protocol and orders. That's why everything you did must be reported. The army court will decide your fate. I'll try to ensure that you're not court-martialed, but I can't promise that.
Abhimanyu nodded and replied.
I understand, sir. Thank you.
Colonel Menon then turned to Nikat and said,
You can't stay here until your identity is confirmed. A medical team with medical aid is going to fly for Kabul. They will come and take you back. You will be handed over to the international authorities in Kabul, who will verify your identity. Then you can return to India, but your child can definitely stay here.
Nikat folded her hands and said thanks to Colonel. Nikat knew that the international authorities in Afghanistan had no real power. The Taliban would not let her go. However, she was relieved that Altaf was now in safe hands. Altaf began to cry, insisting on going with her, but Nikat gently explained that Abhimanyu would take care of him and promised to return soon. Abhimanyu, knowing that her return was impossible, made a decision in his heart and called Major Sarvesh, who was a lawyer in Indian Army. A few hours later, Colonel Menon arrived with the immigration officer. Sarvesh and Sheetal were also there. Before the colonel could say anything, Abhimanyu handed him a paper. He asked,
What is this?
Abhimanyu replied,
Sir, this is Nikat's identification.
After reading, Colonel handed the paper to the immigration officer standing behind him and smiled, saying,
Welcome to India, Mrs. Abhimanyu.
A while earlier, Abhimanyu had called Major Sarvesh and asked him to bring the marriage papers. He then asked Nikat,
I have no one in this world. Will you accept me?
Nikat, crying, replied,
How can I ever repay such a big favor?
Abhimanyu said,
Some favors don't need to be repaid. Just accept me and give me a family.
Nikat rested her head on Abhimanyu's chest and began to cry. Looking at the situation, Nikat and Abhimanyu had no prior relationship, nor did Nikat and Altaf or Abhimanyu and Altaf had any connection. But some relationships are made by circumstances and God. Abhimanyu took Nikat and Altaf's hands and began walking towards the exit of the airport.